In early 2007, the house of a millionaire adult film producer was engulfed in a fiery blaze, and as soon as the fire was contained, a body was found. He was Bryan Kocis, the owner, who could only be officially recognized because of an analysis of his dental arch. The police immediately became suspicious of the main star of their Bryan production company, who was the defendant in a $1 million lawsuit filed by the tycoon. This is the case of Brent Corrigan, an adult film star who had his life turned upside down because of legal problems that prevented him from following his dream, becoming an adult film producer. Sean Paul Lockhart, better known as Brent Corrigan, was born on October 31st, 1986, in Idaho, United States. Coming from a dysfunctional family, he grew up with his mother, stepfather, and 4 siblings. He never met his biological father. His childhood and adolescence were not easy at all, as financial difficulties, his mother and stepfather's alcohol addiction, and constant fights were routine problems at home. At age 16, Brent met an older boy who lived in Los Angeles. They started dating, and Brent started visiting him regularly. His family were not aware of his sexual identity, so this relationship was kept secret. It was this boyfriend that introduced him to the first adult films aimed at a gay audience. He never imagined that there was a market for that, and began to dream that one day he could be one of those actors. He shared this dream with his boyfriend, and he in turn decided to help. In 2004, his boyfriend got the contact of an adult film producer and director, Bryan Kocis, 42 years old at the time. He was the founder of Cobra Video, a studio that was on the rise in the early 2000s. Bryan was born on May 28, 1962, in Fairbanks, Alaska, but was raised in Pennsylvania and worked as a photographer and doctor. His work earned him good purchasing power, which led to the purchase of a huge house in an upper-class neighborhood. In 2001, Bryan became a partner in a telephone venture company, but was removed from the role after being accused of sexual assault on a 15-year-old teenager. Still in the same year, he founded Cobra Video and managed to compete strongly in the adult film market. At first, Bryan recorded his films in a makeshift studio in the basement of his house with just a few cameras and microphones. But over time, Cobra Video grew and consolidated, earning millions of dollars a year and launching new players in the segment. In the meantime, Bryan began to label himself as King Cobra, becoming famous in the industry and attracting young people from all parts of the country. Bryan had a specific taste, a preference for younger guys. Of course, he couldn't have minors in his productions, but nothing prevented him from having adults who appeared to be minors. Because of this, his films mostly featured young people, or twinks, young adults who appeared to be much younger than they really were. However, at the height of his productions, Bryan had a disagreement with one of his actors, who demanded a much larger fee than what he was paying. He was unwilling to pay a higher fee, so the angry boy reported him to the authorities. And the complaint was serious, as this boy was a minor. He had changed the year of his birth on an identification document, but this was unknown to Bryan. The police showed up at the producer's house, took a lot of materials and equipment, and the situation ended up becoming known to the neighbors, who had no idea that an adult film production company was operating in the neighborhood, and even worse with minors. In the end, Bryan managed to prove that he was deceived by the boy. He had all his equipment returned, but he was still sentenced to 1 year in prison, though serving the entire sentence on probation. This situation shook King Cobra and Cobra Video's prestige in the industry, and he somehow needed to get back on his feet. So, in 2004, Bryan decided to recruit new stars for his films so that Cobra Video would have a new brand. It was at this point in his life that he was introduced to Brent. Brent auditioned online, showing off via webcam, and besides being young and handsome, he looked much younger than he really was. The problem here was that he really was new. He was 17 years old, but he said he was 18 so he could act in productions. Days later they met in person. Brent did some camera and performance tests and did very well, sparking Bryan's interest even more. Using a false document, he ended up recording his first film in February 2004. The new actor began to stand out in the market, and with the money raised, Cobra Video was able to make external locations for recording in new settings. Thus, Brent travelled constantly with the director, and they both began to become very close. He ended his relationship with his boyfriend, and consequently, he and Bryan started dating. Brent's films had high sales figures. Cobra Video was making a lot of money. He was indeed an adult film star and quickly became the production company's main source of income. Brent had no problem spending so much time away from home recording. His family didn't care about him. They also had no idea what his job was. And this was interesting because he became famous very quickly, but in a niche group, and the news that he was gay and an adult film actor took a long time to get to his family, and when they heard about it, he was already financially structured and no longer dependent on them. With his career on the rise, the young actor abandoned his given name, Sean Lockhart, and adopted only the stage name Brent Corrigan. Bryan, with all his experience and business expertise, registered the artistic name in a contract linked to the production company Cobra Video. But over time, Brent began to become dissatisfied as he began to understand how the financial market in this industry worked. While the actors earned from recorded scenes, the producers earned from the amount of film sales, and for him, this was unsettling. As I said, he was a phenomenon, but he earned around $2,000 per film, while Cobra Video was making millions per year. This began to cause friction in their relationship due to Brent's dissatisfaction, who now wanted to be a producer in addition to acting. Differences began to emerge. Disagreements became increasingly exhausting, and the two ended their relationship at the end of 2005. The breakup presented him with a chance to pursue his dream of starting his own production company. However, he faced two significant hurdles. The first was a lack of sufficient funds to launch his venture, and the second, and much more complex, the contract with Cobra Video, which involved the exclusive right to use the name Brent Corrigan. Bryan would certainly not authorize the use of his name, linked to films outside his production company. In 2006, at a party, Brent met Grant Roy, a very rich 38-year-old businessman. They became very close and started dating. They decided to live together in Grant's mansion, and over time, they agreed to enter into a partnership where Grant would support the creation of a production company, while Brent would start working as an actor and producer there. That was his dream coming true. But how can you get the public's attention in new films without being able to use his stage Brent Corrigan? Despite the situation, they accepted the legal risks, created their own website, and began recruiting actors for their first films while publicizing his stage name. Brent, on top of that, went on to record other films for other studios using that name, so as not to become a forgotten face in the market. It was then that in 2006, Bryan filed a lawsuit against Brent, asking for payment of $1 million, alleging breach of contract and misuse of the stage name. He had not revealed this problem with Cobra Video to any agency, and when this situation came to light, the studios had to exclude his films from their catalogues. As for the films that Brent had agreed to record, the contracts he managed to maintain, he acted under the name Fox Rider. But things would change drastically in the lives of everyone involved, when on the night of January 24th, 2007, firefighters were called by Bryan's neighbours claiming that his house was on fire. As soon as the fire was contained, officers looked for Bryan, who was lifeless, on the couch, unrecognisable. He was only identified after dental examinations. However, the strangest thing about all this was that he didn't die because of the fire, but rather because of 28 stabs with a knife and a deep cut across his throat that went from ear to ear. About 4 months earlier, in the fall of 2006, Brent had received an email from a young man named Harlow Quadra, who was also an aspiring adult film producer. He was born in 1980 and grew up in Florida. He had serious financial difficulties, and he lived with his mother and 3 brothers in a small apartment. And due to the lack of beds, everyone was forced to sleep on the floor. In 2000, at the beginning of adulthood, at age 20, Harlow managed to join the Navy, moving to the city of Virginia Beach. But after 2 years of service, he was released because of a back injury. Soon after this, Harlow met Joe Kocis through an online chat. Joe, 28, ran an escort website. After having virtual conversations, they met in person at a shopping mall. The chemistry was very strong, and sometime later, they were already dating. Soon after the start of the relationship, he also started working as an escort, using his boyfriend's own website. He didn't like being an escort, but as it was difficult to find a job with his back injury, he ended up going the route he considered easier. Seeing his boyfriend Joe with a business profile, Harlow imagined herself in a similar position and had the dream of being an adult film producer, which, as I said, was a market that was on the rise at that time. During the following years, they made significant profits from small productions and thought about expanding the business, mainly because they lived an extravagant life with jewelry, luxurious cars, parties, and being present in high-end mansions. They began to spend much more than they earned, thus incurring numerous debts. The only way they found to be able to afford the luxurious life they had was to make an extraordinary production that earned them a lot of money. And that was how they remembered the name Brent Corrigan. Harlow and Joe wanted to have Brent in their films and started to keep in touch, offering job offers. On the other hand, he and Grant were a little suspicious because their promises were surreal. They offered around $20,000 per film, which was 10 times more than normal. But at the same time, if that was true, it was a proposal they couldn't let go of. After much insistence, the couple agreed to meet with Harlow and Joe. On January 11th, 2007, the four met in Las Vegas for dinner during the Adult Video News Convention, an exclusive event for industry professionals. The luxurious dinner lasted more than 2 hours. The two couples discussed their plans for the future, including fees. Harlow really wanted Brent to act in his films and even promised extra earnings from part of the sales. However, the couple explained the situation involving Bryan and the impediment of using the name Brent Corrigan. The dinner ended without much progress in the negotiations, and the next day Harlow and Joe returned to Virginia Beach, while Brent and Grant to San Diego. And in less than 2 weeks, Bryan was found charred on the couch in his mansion. But who had done that to him? Brent, Grant, Harlow, Joe, some of them, or all of them? police began to investigate homicide and arson and realized that several objects had been stolen from the house, including very expensive watches, camcorders, and computers. From the first moment, investigators suspected Brent due to the legal battles between him and the victim. However, the couple were able to prove that on the night of the crime, they were in San Diego, more than 5,000 kilometers away from Bryan's home. But not being present doesn't make you innocent. The police began to search through Bryan's contacts. King Cobra was down in the market, and the company needed to get back on its feet. For this reason, Bryan was very active on the internet, looking for new actors with similar characteristics to Brent, but who at the same time surpassed his acting skills. And that's how Bryan met Danny Moylin. On January 22nd, Bryan and Danny started exchanging a lot of messages. He seemed to be the physically perfect boy to help Cobra Video return to the spotlight. But Danny was very naive, stating that he had no experience in the adult industry and would need to learn how to act. This air of naivety made Bryan even more interested in Danny. So they arranged a private meeting at Bryan's house. Investigators accessed the profile that Danny used to exchange messages with Bryan and released his photo publicly, asking for the public's help in trying to find the young man. To the investigators' surprise, they received several anonymous calls from Virginia Beach saying that the young man in the photo, Danny Moylin, was actually Harlow Quadra. When the police called Brent again to find out if he knew him, the situation of the couple's meeting on January 11th came to light, and he even added an interesting detail to the conversation they had that day. He said that Harlow had dropped a hint about taking Bryan out of the game, and that he had a client who could do it. Brent and Grant took the comment as a joke at the time, especially because everyone had drunk too much. But now, with this crime situation, they began to get suspicious. Harlow became the main suspect for the crime, and the clues found were unbelievable. His credit card records showed a payment of $39.95 on January 20th on a police website for criminal background checks. When they looked in the system to see which search was linked to that card, the result was Bryan Kocis. Police believed it was through this query that Harlow obtained the victim's address. 2 days later, on the 22nd, the exchange of emails between Bryan and Danny, in this case Harlow, began. On the 23rd, still on Harlow's credit card, there was a registration for a weapons store. While checking the cameras at the scene, the police saw Harlow and Joe buying a knife, a .38 caliber revolver and ammunition. That same day, still using the same card, they rented an SUV and booked a hotel room for 2 nights, in a location a few kilometers from Bryan's house. The police executed a search warrant at the suspect's residence. Although Harlow and Joe weren't home, officers discovered several items stolen from Bryan's house. This glaring oversight highlighted either their inexperience or a brazen lack of fear of being caught. The evidence was overwhelmingly clear. With the pieces falling into place, the police were convinced that Harlow and Joe were responsible. But questions lingered about Brent's involvement. Was he an accomplice? Did he conspire to commit the crime? Or was he entirely unaware of their plans? After several months evading capture, Harlow and Joe reached out to Brent and Grant, persistently pushing to revive the film project. They, however, alerted the police about the calls and disclosed that the fugitive couple was hiding in South Beach, Miami. From that moment, they discreetly collaborated with the investigators. Despite the mounting evidence linking Harlow and Joe to Bryan's murder, the police needed a confession to solidify their case and expedite the judicial process. They aimed to catch them red-handed, revealing their involvement through their own words. Using wiretaps, they hoped the content of the conversations would unearth whether all parties, including Brent, were involved in the gruesome crime. So Brent and Grant arranged a meeting with the fugitives to discuss business plans. The meeting would take place in San Diego on April 27th in a restaurant. However, the meeting was a little frustrating, as the authorities were unable to get a clear confession. A new meeting was later arranged, but Harlow insisted on meeting at a nude beach, as Joe was suspicious that they were being watched. Brent and Grant accepted, as they didn't want to raise suspicions. The agents had to come up with a detailed plan, especially in relation to the bugs, which were placed on objects that Brent and Grant could carry, such as keys and bracelets. During this meeting, Harlow ended up admitting the crime, in a sentence in which he said more or less the following: "Seeing that son of a bitch dying was sickening, but it made me feel better inside. It almost felt like I was getting revenge." Apart from that part, the officers were unable to find any other part where they could place Brent and Grant in the position of suspects. So, on May 15th, 2007, Harlow and Joe were arrested and formally charged with Bryan's murder. Joe made a deal with the authorities to avoid the possibility of the death penalty and made a written confession that they went to Bryan's house determined to kill him. Harlow in turn said that it was Joe who killed Bryan alone. Because of this, the two ended up having separate trials. The pair faced serious charges: first and second degree murders, arson, and tampering with evidence. Both were eventually found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Harlow, to this day, claims he is innocent. In 2016, the film King Cobra was released, which tells the story of Brent. The cast has very famous names such as Alicia Silverstone, Garrett Clayton, and James Franco. However, Brent himself was highly critical of the production of the film, which, according to his statements, corresponds more to a fictional work than a report of actual reality. He and Grant separated, and although he later gained the right to use the name Brent Corrigan, he never managed to regain the same fame he had before. He made some films, working mainly for Falcon Studios, and tried to pursue a career as an actor in conventional films, but only managed to get minor roles. He currently makes a living by making rare appearances in some films, but his main source of income comes from selling personal adult content that he publishes on his private social networks.